Yeah, he's doing fine. He's at home and surgery went well. He's taking some time to go. So just right.
So is that your
I was gonna say, is this something I said? No.
Yeah.
That's it. I'm done.
Where are you? I know.
It's good to see everyone this morning. I better get started before more people start leaving. All right.
Sorry for being late for class.
As we get started this morning, Barry, could you lead us in an opening prayer?
We thank you for the opportunity to come together this morning and study more of your word. We thank you for your word, for the answers that we get, for the wisdom, knowledge. Thank you for your son, Jesus. Thank you, pray.
Amen. I invite you to open up with me to Matthew chapter 11. We're picking up our study this morning. Jesus is, at this point, is finished his commissioning of the 12 apostles that we've wrapped up studying a little while ago, and warning them about some of the things they were going to face, some of the things that come with being a disciple of his, a follower of his, some of the very things he himself was going to go through. But hadn't really gone through much yet. Same with the disciples. He was trying to prepare them because they were about to go out and about to face some of these things. It's not something that they were in the thick of in the moment. It was something that lied ahead. And as we come into chapter 11, we find that there is somebody that we read about here at the beginning who has already come under the kind of things that Jesus was warning about, the kind of persecution, the kind of punishment for standing up for what is right that we know await all followers of Christ from time to time. And of course, we're speaking about John the Baptist. We've talked a little about him in these first handful of verses in the past couple classes, and we know from verse 2 in Matthew 11 that he was in prison at this time, that he was suffering in there, that he sent out this word by his disciples to ask Jesus a question. And the question was, are you the one who is to come? Even though he himself had been the one to proclaim that he was the one that they had been waiting for. So are you the one, or shall we look for another, is the question he asked in verse 3. And Jesus rather kindly and patiently, without really any hint of criticism in asking that kind of question, answered in verse 4, go and tell John what you hear and see. And he listed out the things that he had been up to. We know that Jesus had been traveling around even before he commissioned the apostles, traveling around from city to city, healing them, working these signs, these miracles, teaching them. And from verse 1, we find that he went out to go do the same thing after he finished sending them out. And here we have him telling these disciples of John to go tell John that he's been up to this and what's been happening. The things that he hasn't been witnessing himself, but may have heard rumblings about, and maybe not. Maybe he doesn't know much of what happened, and this is what he's. Jesus sends those messengers back to John with. Is these wonderful miracles that he's been working, this healing and this cleansing that's taking place, the dead that are being raised up, and the poor having the good news preached to them. And, we talked a little bit in our last class that here John is suffering in prison and wanting Jesus to confirm who he is, and that there are other ways of trying to figure out what his motives here were. Was it just doubt? Did he just lose his faith somehow, even momentarily? And I think Chris covered some of those different things that it could be. I think that as we look through this text and this context of the rest of this chapter, that it's in my understanding most fitting that he is talking about losing some of the confidence that he had here, facing these kind of facing the situation that he is in. And we find as we look throughout and we think through the New Testament and what a lot of the Christians in the first century faced and what it caused, the struggles that it caused in their faith, in their conviction, in their confidence, and in their focus. This is something that isn't unique to John in struggling with this kind of thing. It's quite common for the faithful to wonder if they're headed in the right direction when things aren't working out for them the way that they expect. And we can all relate to that, can't we? It's easy to have that strong faith and just be overjoyed with the blessings that we have in Christ when things are going well, when we're benefiting from the relationships that we have with our family, following God's principles, and things are working out wonderfully. And we have those strong relationships with our brothers and sisters here when there isn't conflict and division. Right? But what about when those things get broken down? It's easy to wonder. It's easy to lose that focus on where our faith truly lies when that happens. And so I want us to just briefly look at a couple passages before we move on just from this section. Just two of them I want to look at for right now, where we can see the commonality between the question that John asked, which is, shall we look for another, and what these disciples were struggling with in some of the letters that Paul wrote to various churches, which were driven, the questions that they asked, or the reason that Paul wanted to address these things is because of the affliction and the evil that these Christians were facing on a daily basis, and what it was doing to their focus and to their faith. So first, let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians 11. And we'll begin by reading verses 2 through 4. And Michelle, can you read that for us?
For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it.
Okay, so here's kind of just an introduction to what Paul was going to be addressing them about, which was that he was worried for them, that they're surrounded by all these different things that are pulling them in different directions, things that may cause them to doubt that pure, sincere devotion to Christ at the end of verse 3, that Paul was afraid for them. Right? And likewise, any leader, the elders here, the teachers, this is something that that everyone is concerned about when you have a responsibility of feeding people and of building up the church and making sure that we have what we need to face what the many things that could pull us away from having this sincere, this pure devotion to Christ, even in the face of trouble. That's what we're doing when we come together here and we encourage each other and we hear, we listen to lessons, we study together in these classes. We have conversations individually with one another, with the elders. These are, we're trying to prepare ourselves for this potential situation where we're led astray. This is something we're all susceptible to. And here, I just want us to notice the commonality in this language between there in verse 4, between here when it talks about people coming to possibly proclaim another Jesus. Right? And you think, well, how could somebody fall for that? Why would somebody fall for this other Jesus? And you have to remember how new all of this was at the time. We're looking at it through this lens of history and through this all the time that we've studied. We have this huge collection of writings that we look at, or that we have access to, and these churches were still figuring out a lot of things. They were still receiving these letters with instruction. They were still working out these different conflicts that came up by having these very diverse groups of people coming together as one family, right? You had Jews and Gentiles and poor people and rich people that normally didn't associate with each other and had different practices, different beliefs that they had to work out depending on the background of where you were coming from. And it could be very easy to be led off the path of, was this Jesus the actual one we were expecting? Or are there others? Lots of things were happening in this day. Many signs being worked, and it'd be very easy to be led astray if you lose this focus. But again, we see that topic being addressed here, and also let's look at Galatians chapter 1. And here we'll just read verses 6 through 8. And Stacy, can you read that for us? Galatians 1, 6 through 8.
I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. That even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed.
Okay, so again, we see this language of this idea of there being another. He talks about a different gospel, not that there is another one, right? The gospel is centered on Jesus, right? So he is he is in this as much as we're just talking about the good news. He is the good news, right? So this is another way of saying the same thing, that people are being led astray from that simple, pure devotion to Christ and their faith in who he is. And that what he has and what he offered is what we need, that he is the way. And of course, he goes into to talk about the dangers of turning to a different gospel, that there is not another one. Even if somebody claims to have received it from an angel or something else, if it's against what that core focus on Jesus, and we don't have a ton of insight into all the things that were being preached, but it could be all kinds of things that would potentially sound more appealing to somebody who's facing this very strong persecution, that would be facing these kind of situations that we know that the Corinthians and that the Galatians were facing at this time. So don't chase after the false promises of these people. Don't chase after just go doing something because it's the easier way or because there's going to be less persecution if it compromises that focus on Jesus and following him. Carl?
Over there in 2 Corinthians, he said the devil, the subtlety of the devil, he fooled, he actually told her a lie. And here in Galatians, there's some, if you look around yourself today, this is happening. There's people, brothers and sisters in Christ that are changing the gospel a little bit. That's what he's warning about here. He said not another gospel, but there's some people that are changing the gospel. Well, actually, it becomes something other than the gospel when they change it. But he's warning against it. And this is a warning for us today also, because you'll find many places where there's Church of Christ out front, but they won't be following the gospel. Some things they will follow, but they'll add other things. But a big thing today is there are a lot of churches of Christ that are bringing the organ and the piano into their worship. That's adding to what we have here. But it's happening all over the country.
Yeah, well, it can happen in all kinds of ways, right? Again, oftentimes it's the subtle things, and that's why we all need, just because we don't have X or Y here doesn't mean we're not susceptible to the same kind of, flaws in our thinking or distortions to what the true gospel is. And what it means to actually in principle and in action and in teaching to follow Jesus. This is something that we all need to be prepared for and watch and stay focused on. And but this isn't we've up to this point we've up through verse 5 here in our main text, Matthew chapter 11. This is the news that they were to bring back to John. But it doesn't end there in verse 5. He also continues in verse 6, where he says, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Do other people have translations that read something a little different than that for verse 5? Or, sorry, for verse 6? What does yours say?
Mine says, blessed is he who is not offended because of.
Okay. Gotcha. Any other ones? Just curious what. Yes, LaShawn.
It says, "And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in."
Okay. So, and then so the main word that I was looking at here is this word offended, which is some versions will translate this in other ways, but this word scandalizo is the original word that means for this, and it's translated in different ways in different passages as we read throughout the scripture. But the one kind of commonality that we see between Sometimes it's translated to fall away or to even just to fall. Some versions will translate it in other parts, like when Jesus talks about if your eye causes you to what? To sin. Okay, that's scandalizo, the same word, right? Or some versions may read to stumble. If your eye causes you to stumble, cast it out. And so I think the commonality that we see between these things is this idea of finding an occasion to stumble. Right? That's I think that's the idea of this word from my studies of it here. Was there a hand that was up? No? Okay. And so blessed is the one who is not offended by me, or who doesn't find occasion to stumble because of me, because of what Jesus was bringing, right? Which was very easy to do. This is something that was prophesied about, as we'll look at here in just a moment from Isaiah, that what Jesus was bringing, both in himself, his example, how he brought this kingdom, how he showed his power and his kingship, was flipped a lot of ways from what people expected. Right? People expected one thing, and Jesus would often accomplish the same purpose, but in a completely different way. He would, and oftentimes that would cause people to stumble. And it's kind of like I was trying to think of an analogy of how this works, and similar to how Isaiah phrased it. But we think about today, and we have like stairs to get up here, right? And a stair, what is it? Stair is something to stumble over, right? Many people do that. You look at little kids learning to walk, like they try to go up a stair, they're probably going to stumble. Older people, as they have trouble walking, right? Stairs become a liability to them, right? It's something dangerous that you have to be very careful for, because what it is, it's something different than the flat stuff all around you. And therefore, what it is something to be stumbled over. But it's also something to get you where you need to go. Oftentimes, you can't get to a place unless there's a stair, right? Because our legs are only so long. We can only do, we have limitations. And so stairs enable us to get somewhere that we couldn't go without the stair. But only if we accept that it's a stair, that it's there to get us to where we're going. And we accept what it is and why it's there. And so looking at Isaiah chapter 8, it's interesting the way that Jesus is talked about in this prophecy. Let's begin first in chapter 8, verses 14 and 15. Isaiah 8, verses 14 and 15. Lajana, can you read that for us? 14 and 15.
And he shall be for a sanctuary, and for a stone of stumbling, and for a rock of offense to both the house of Israel, for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble and fall, and be broken, and be snared, and be taken.
Okay, so it's interesting that in a verse that begins with, he will become a sanctuary, that the very next thing it says is that he will be a stone of stumbling, or a stone of offense, as some versions might read, a rock of stumbling, both to both houses of Israel. Also describes him as like a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And what is a trap and a snare? It's kind of a side point, but why do traps or snares work? Well, hopefully not people, or animals sometimes. Right? I mean, it could be used on a person, but right. Normally, it's because animals they won't recognize what it is. Right? They're not aware of it. Exactly. So, yeah, there are things that aren't expected. And that's exactly what Jesus was. When you look at the response to his teachings, when you look at the reactions of people to what he was teaching, and even us today, some of the things that he teaches are very challenging. We know this. We're going through chapters 5 through 7 in Matthew. There's a lot of things in there that are kind of upside down from the way that we normally think and the way we normally approach life. And so So it describes him here, and it's interesting in Isaiah. Okay, here we have him being described as a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. But later in Isaiah, we also have him being described as a cornerstone, right? Another type of stone, right? But a cornerstone, a firm foundation, right? So we see this kind of parallel, and this is later on in chapter 28. We won't read it right now for the sake of time, but again, we have this kind of dual nature of what he is. Like, yes, he's going to be something that people trip over, that cause some people to stumble. If the results of what he's teaching, of their dedication to him even, doesn't work out like they planned, it's an occasion to stumble. But at the same time, he's a cornerstone. He's the foundation, right, of everything that, everything we believe, everything that is true, everything that will get us to where we need to go is in Jesus. Next, let's turn over to James chapter 1. And before we read that, I just accidentally skipped over another passage that I had, which was in John chapter 6. We read about these hard sayings that Jesus had of him talking about his eating his body, right? Those who eat on him will, or who eat his flesh. There in John chapter 6. In the beginning, about verse 60, he would teach things in these figures that were difficult for people to grasp if they weren't understanding them as figures. And his disciples there in verse 61 said, these are hard sayings, and they grumbled among themselves. These are hard sayings. Who can accept this? And we saw that we see that language being used there, that it caused them to take offense or to stumble. Right, because they didn't understand what he was doing with his analogy that he was making, and so kind of just showing the parallel between this idea of hard sayings leading to grumbling, which then lead to this idea of stumbling or taking offense over something that Jesus was teaching. And so we come to James chapter 1, and we see a very similar idea here as we read in Matthew. So in James chapter 1, verse 12 says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." So again, this is the opposite of stumbling, right? When you're under trial, the opposite of stumbling is what? Remaining steadfast, right? When we're facing these different trials, we see this contrast here about, Jesus said, "Blessed is the man who doesn't stumble, doesn't take offense," and here it says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast," right? And we kind of see this comparison. This comparison between these two verses and these ideas being kind of brought together in the same kind of language here. So, and also while we're in James, let's look at chapter 5. And this is just so powerful here. James chapter 5, let's read verses 7 through 11. James 5, 7 through 11. And Gwendolyn, can you read those for us?
Sure. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful.
All right. This ties in so many ways to what we're reading about with John. John, we know, was a prophet. Jesus is just about to get to that point there, right? And that's the example that he uses here of this idea of being steadfast is like the prophets. And so here we have this kind of line of thought of what it takes to not be offended, to not, and I think that word is a little problematic because we use that word in a different way today than I think the Bible is using it here. It's one of those difficult words that are translated. It's difficult to translate into a single word in English. But this idea of stumbling, right? How do you remain steadfast when when everything around you is making you stumble? When your circumstances and everything around you. And so we see that here in chapter 5, verses 7 through 11, as we look through this, it begins by talking about patience, right? Patience is that being steadfast when you're under the load of something, is be patient with it, and that leads to being established. Right, that leads to being established, as we see there. And then he says, like the prophets, right? We could look to certain prophets for how established they were in the face of these heavy trials. And Job was one of them, right? Job was one of these who we look to. And what do we get from Job when we look at his story, right? He had everything, and yet it was all stripped away from him. Right, and what does he learn throughout that whole experience, Carl?
He never turned his back on the Lord. He remained faithful to the Lord. And
Why? What helped him to do that, though? What helped him to be faithful?
faith in God.
Okay, and what about is that God existed, or something else, something deeper in what he expected of God? Sorry, I'm not saying this is an easy question, but when we look at Job and the arguments that he would use to, as far as why he was believing, and what we read throughout the point that this passage here is making, is that we need to witness how God's purpose unfolds over time. Right? That's what keeps us going. We're looking ahead and we have faith, right? Even when we're going through hard times, what is it that we have faith in? Right? It's not just that God exists, right? It's that God has a purpose and he has promises that he's made us, and those exist out there, right? And they may be ahead. They may feel like they're nowhere near us now, because think about John. He's in this prison, suffering there in prison. But that there is a purpose that it unfolds over time, and therefore trust God because we trust in his purpose and what he's doing through us, through the circumstances that we're in. That's what gives us the ability to have that patience and to be steadfast, right? Is that it's part of something greater. There are promises that are still unfolding. There's his purpose that is still unfolding, both in our lives and in this world. And that gives us the ability to carry on past whatever circumstances that we're facing, because it builds our trust in him, knowing that he's faithful to fulfill those purposes. John, do you have your hand up?
Well, we have to remember that God knows what he's doing. And he's doing what he wants. It's not what we want. So often we get our own plans confused and say, well, this is the way it should be. And God's not doing that.
We get our own purpose mixed up with his purpose.
You know, like John probably didn't think that he should be in jail. Israel where they're not loving you at all. When his plans were to do good throughout his life, his good was not accepted. So you've got to remember that God has a plan. We've got to go along with it, not try and make our own plans.
Yeah, well, not only go along with it, but to trust it, because oftentimes it's not obvious to us. Like we can only see so far, right? John from his prison cell wasn't like prisons today, where you have TV, right, where you staying up to date on the news and the latest, the latest happenings in the different cities and towns and world news and all that. Not that prison today is any great thing, but very cut off. Right, as far as John, he had these disciples that he was able to send out, thankfully, and I'm sure that word that he got back from them was something that really helped him, in this, because like this passage in James ends on here, James chapter 5 in verse 11. You have heard the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Right, to focus on that. Terry?
The story of Job was put in there for a very good purpose now, it's for us. And even though God allowed all of those things to happen to Job, it was to help us see. I promised you that I would not give you more than you can bear. Trust me, and I will get you through it. And even as far as his wife pushing him to go against God's, he never faltered. He did not stumble. He went right through it. And you have to know, it just about killed him, literally, physically, and emotionally.
Oh, yeah.
But he never once, like Paul said, never once gave up his faith. And that's there for us to learn that it is possible to go through those things and still stay strong.
Yeah, well, that's a great book to go back and read. I've done that in some of my hardest times. Just go back and read Job, right? And it helps you, again, what Jesus needs John to do, what James is doing here is look to them. That's what it's there for. Because oftentimes things don't turn out like we're expecting, like with John. We're running out of time here, but we see a lot of hints as to what John was expecting when we read Matthew chapter 3, which we studied months and months ago now. But just quickly, before we close here, Matthew chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, and we just look at this language that he's using here, where he begins by saying, even now the axe is laid at the root of the trees. Right? What does that mean? That means that something is about to happen, right now. It's laid to the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that doesn't bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. I baptize you with water for repentance, but he who is coming after me is mightier than I. Right? That someone mighty is coming, that the axe is laid at the root of the trees. He says he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. Verse 12, his winnowing fork is in his hand. Right? He's ready. This is about to happen. Right? John's preaching was very powerful. He was very zealous in his teaching here, and the way he's wording things. It's in his hand. He will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn, but the chaff will be burned with unquenchable fire. Right? We just see through the kind of language that John uses that how his expectations could have been a little different if he didn't quite understand the depth of everything that he was saying. Everything he was saying was true, but oftentimes it unfolded in ways different than even the prophets knew about. Right? We see that even with the Old Testament prophets, referring back to them as saying that these are things that the prophets, even though they were prophesying about these things, longed to look, because they didn't know the details of how everything was going to unfold. Right? Oftentimes things unfolded even to those closest to Jesus, who he spent every day with and talking to them with. They unfolded in much different ways than even they expected. And it was frustrating to them oftentimes. We don't have time to look into a lot of those examples now. But you can see that perhaps maybe the coming of Jesus and what that meant, as far as John's perception of that, was maybe too gentle, too slow for what he was expecting, especially the hopeless feeling that would come from being stuck in prison. And yeah, struggling is Herod king here? Is Jesus king, right? Herod's the one who put him in prison. When's he going to get out? You could just kind of relate to maybe some of the things that John was struggling with and asking that kind of question from Jesus. So we didn't get very far this morning, but I think it was good conversation. I appreciate it.
So, well, what?
Jerry, you done with your meditation? What? You done with your meditation? Right? Have you completed your meditation?